Hello and happy October. This is Will with In Our Honest Opinion, bringing you the first package of the 31 Nights of Fright. I just want to thank you guys for jumping in. I know week after week we hit you up with the latest in what's happening with pop culture, movie news, and all the other stuff that makes us tick. But this time we just wanted you to sit back, listen to a little creepy music, and get lost in our second attempt at our seasonal special of the Ioho 31 Nights of Fright. You can listen to these daily over on In Our Honest Opinion Sidetracked, where you'll be able to actually get the 10 to 15 minute episodes delivered to you every day for the month of October. We've also got a couple contests running, so keep a close ear and eye out on adamanalyzes.com and also over at inouronestopinion.com. But anyways, let me stop distracting you. Thanks again for downloading. Thanks for subscribing. Remember, guys, you can hit us up at our websites. You can hit us up on our Instagram at IOHO_podcast. But more importantly, you can get lost in the sounds of Adam and his 31 Nights of Fright, Year 2, the sequel.
Hello and welcome to night number 1 of 31 Nights of Frights, Part 2, the sequel. I don't know if that title will officially stick or not, probably not. But anyway, welcome back for year number 2 of 31 Nights of Frights, presented by In Our Honest Opinion. I'm glad to have you back, and if you are a first-time listener, hopefully you guys enjoy what I'm doing here. We got 31 movies for the month of October, 31 horror films that I picked, and hopefully they might be some obscurities. And if they're not obscurities, hopefully I provide little bit of a different spin on the film itself. But anyway, I think we should get into night number 1. And night number 1 is going to be the 1982 Stephen King written, George A. Romero directed anthology classic, Creepshow. For those of you who do not know, Creepshow is an anthology movie that is meant to basically be a homage to the 50s EC comics, such as Haunt of Fear, Vault of Horror, Tales from the Crypt, all of those like that, even shock suspense stories most likely, judging by the way one of the stories pans out here. It was always meant to be a homage, and I think they're successful with what they did here. It is one of my favorite horror movies of all time, and it's a movie that I've seen a lot. I don't know how many times, but I do know that it was always playing on HBO when I was a kid and being snowed in many times in the winter in Pennsylvania. It's one of those that I always had on for whatever reason. Since this is an anthology movie, we do get treated to a couple different stories here. And I think all of them are actually pretty good and pretty entertaining. They seem to have a little bit of a sense of humor about them and a little bit of a ironic type of feel. And that is very much true to the original EC Comics tradition. So they essentially made a Tales from the Crypt movie without a Tales from the Crypt license. And that alone, I think, should be applauded. The various stories that we have here, we have a wraparound story about a abusive husband and father. We also have a story about Father's Day and the murderous father that comes back from the grave. We are also treated to some acting with Stephen King providing his acting chops, which is suitably over the top and goofy, in a story about a meteor with, fungus growth. A story about infidelity, which has Leslie Nielsen in a villainous role, which is pretty awesome as well. And also a husband who really hates his wife, and rather than divorcing her like any regular person would do, he gets rid of her in a very unconventional manner by basically feeding her to a Antarctic ape creature. And we get a final story here about a germaphobe who's a very horrible person, and he winds up getting his just desserts by a gross sequence with numerous cockroaches and various bugs. So that is a lot of stories going on here, and in true anthology fashion, some are stronger than others, but a lot of the ones here presented are actually pretty good in their own right. So even if it is a lesser story, it's fun to watch. Not just for you, the audience, but you get this. I have a feeling that George Romero and Stephen King actually had a lot of fun on this. Not only that, we got some really cool effects from Tom Savini and a very young Greg Nicotero. If you don't know Greg Nicotero, he's actually doing a Creepshow TV show coming up on Shudder. And he worked with Tom Savini and George Romero back in the day on this one. It was one of his first jobs interning. So I actually think it's a pretty cool movie overall. We have a great cast here. Not only do we have Stephen King acting, we also have such actors as Ted Danson, Adrienne Barbeau, Ed Harris, E.G. Marshall. I mean, the cast here is awesome. We even get actress Galen Ross, who you may know from George Romero's Dawn of the Dead. It's an awesome cast that was assembled here, and I love that it kind of was a precursor in a lot of ways to what was done with the HBO Tales from the Crypt TV show, with having a lot of different guest actors on that show as well as guest directors. So Creepshow really, I guess, started something here, and sadly in its following sequels, which I may get to on further 31 Nights of Frights episodes, you don't have that star power moving forward. This was almost like a lightning in the bottle. I even forgot to mention great horror veteran actor Tom Atkins is in the wraparound story. I mean, we really get a lot of cool actors that you've seen in other things, and maybe doing something different here that you may not be, I guess, accustomed to seeing them doing. I will say that probably my favorite, story, my favorite one would be the one with Stephen King and his portrayal of Gordy and the fungus that's growing over him. Stephen King, it's hard not to laugh at him in this, because not only does he go over the top with his acting and it works for the story that's presented, but we also have him pretty much cross-eyed the entire story, and that is some devotion to acting right there. It totally fits. Everything about that one fits, and it's my favorite one. Not only that, it does have little ties to other Stephen King stories, which I think is pretty cool. So it's pretty neat how it all fits into the, I guess, Stephen King multiverse. And while this isn't a 100% official Stephen King film, as far as fitting in with his other works, it definitely does at the same time. So if you have not seen Creepshow, I definitely recommend checking it out. I am a huge fan of Creepshow, and a very lesser extent on its other ones, but we got some entertaining acting. We got pretty good star power of the time and people that you would still know today. And not only that, the direction is good. It really captures that EC vibe, especially when people go to get killed. It goes and it almost cuts to a colorful background, and the movie itself is extremely colorful and bold with its choices. It very much invokes a comic book brought to life. So everything that they were trying to do they succeeded 100% in my eyes. This year definitely ranks up pretty high on my list as far as absolute favorite horror films. Not only that, I am a definite sucker for anthologies and short stories. I love the short form way of writing, and I also love the anthology films, how we get little miniature films, usually about anywhere from 10 to say 20 minutes in length. So you never really have a chance to get bored. If you didn't like something, then hey, guess what? There's another story coming up and you may like that one better. And that's one of the best things about an anthology movie. It captures imagination because you usually get treated to different feeling stories or miniature episodes within the movie. And this actually does a great job of doing different things, and I can't say enough about it. I'm giving it 100% a recommendation on watching and just having fun with it. It is a definite fun horror film. The tagline of the movie was, "It's the most fun you'll ever have being scared." And I think it is a good tagline because you're definitely going to have more fun than actually being scared. I will say that when I was a kid, I did get creeped out by that Arctic ape thing from, I think it's Antarctica is actually where it's supposed to be from. I was freaked out by that, and that was actually pretty creepy for me when I was a kid. Not so much anymore, but the animatronic or puppetry on it is still impressive to this very day. So hats off to you, Mr. Tom Savini. Definitely one of the greats, and still are one of the greats. But I think this is actually going to go and close out night number 1 of 31 Nights of Frights. Hopefully you guys really enjoyed it. As a reminder, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Adam_analyzes. Also, you can go to adamanalyzes.com and keep your ears open because we are going to have a contest running for 31 Nights of Frights, and I think you guys are really going to enjoy the prize that we're doing this year. But with that, good night. Hello and welcome to night number 2 of 31 Nights of Frights, Year 2, the sequel. Yeah, that's not going to stick. But anyway, this is Year 2 and day number 2. So, hopefully you guys enjoyed the night number 1, what I said about Creepshow. And for night number 2, I think we're going to do a little bit more of a controversial one. Not controversial for content, controversial because people seem to really hate it, and I really love it. That's right, it is the Tommy Lee Wallace 1982 classic, in my opinion, Halloween 3, Season of the Witch. So a little history on Halloween 3, Season of the Witch. This is a much hated horror film by a lot of people. However, it has gained in popularity a little bit throughout the years. People seem to recognize what they were trying to do with it, and I think it was a wise move creatively, probably not a wise move financially. So Halloween 3 picks up, well, it doesn't pick up anywhere. Halloween 3 was its own animal, its own beast, its own movie. Michael Myers was dead at the end of Halloween 2, and John Carpenter really didn't have an interest in continuing the Michael Myers story because, hey, we saw him die, or so we thought, in Halloween 2. So, Halloween 3, they thought, hey, let's go ahead and make an anthology series of films where each one would say that it was a Halloween film, and we would release it in October around Halloween. And, well, it would be a different story every year. I honestly really like that idea. I think it was a great idea, and hats off to John Carpenter for not wanting to milk the Halloween series any more than what it was already milked. I don't think there ever needed to be any sequels to Halloween. However, we did get multiple sequels to varying degrees of quality, and this here is kind of its own thing. And I don't know, like I really enjoy it. I like the story that's told, and it kind of feels like a Tales from the Crypt kind of story in a way, or EC Comics, however you want to look at it. But it definitely has that kind of vibe and feel. The movie's very colorful as well, just like Creepshow was. And I really like the actors that are involved. The two that are standouts, for one, I really like Tom Atkins. Tom Atkins, he was in a lot of different things. He was in Maniac Cop. He was in Night of the Creeps. He was also in Creepshow. Not a very big role in Creepshow, but he was in it. He's just one of those cool actors, in my opinion, and I like that he has made a name for himself by being in horror films. In addition to Tom Atkins, we also get actor Dan O'Herlihy. If the name doesn't sound familiar, I guarantee you've seen him in RoboCop. Also, he was in Twin Peaks, another cool actor, and he is awesome here as the villainous Connell Cochran, the head of Silver Shamrock Toys. But before we get too far into the actors and everything involved, or if they did a good job or whatnot, I think we should go and talk about the plot of the movie. So the plot of Halloween 3 is pretty far-fetched and way out there, but it definitely works for what's presented in the film. You're treated to a silver shamrock pumpkin at the beginning of the film, and that little theme song will definitely be stuck in your head by the time the movie is done. But we got the Silver Shamrock Company. Their masks are basically the hot thing this year for Halloween. Every kid wants them. Stores can't keep them in stock. And there winds up being a guy that's brought into a hospital, and he's clutching one of the Silver Shamrock masks. And that leads a doctor to basically go and try to investigate what happened and why this guy was killed for, I guess, discovering a conspiracy. And there is a definite conspiracy angle here, and it definitely works in its favor. So I don't want to get too far into it. Just know that Michael Myers does kind of make an appearance. He is shown on TV in the background in one shot. And also, this does feature Jamie Lee Curtis. She is, anytime you hear a voiceover in the movie, such as a operator or the curfew in town, that's actually Jamie Lee Curtis, and it's cool that they got her back in almost a cameo capacity here. If we want to get back to a plot point, there is a definite trick or treat type of, I guess, sick joke, if you want to consider that. Also, there winds up being animatronic robots. I don't know if they're actually robots or not, but they're there. We also have Stonehenge. Yes, a rock from Stonehenge makes an appearance. No, it's not an actual rock from Stonehenge, but it's there as well. Now, if all that sounds goofy, that's because it is. This movie, plot-wise, is incredibly goofy, but it's also incredibly original with what they were doing here. The direction from Tommy Lee Wallace is spot on. It definitely feels like a John Carpenter flick, a John Carpenter directed flick. And I guess that's from Tommy Lee Wallace and his time of working on Halloween 1 and 2. So it definitely has that sort of feel about it. It's just not there plot-wise. But you are treated to some of the various graphic kills in the movie. This movie has some very inventive ways of killing people. It has some genuine nastiness to it, and it's a definite nasty movie. It's not too bad as far as the gore, not enough to really off-put me or gross me out. However, do know that it is more graphic than the other Halloween films, in my opinion. I mean, obviously that's a bit of, I guess, personal opinion and preference and such, but I do think that this is one of the nastier films in the series, if you want to actually consider it part of the series, and I actually do not. This is a standalone, so I don't actually consider it a Halloween film, even though it is technically Halloween 3. One of the best things about it, we do get some good music from John Carpenter. I absolutely love that guy's scores, and this one here is no exception. He did a great job with his work on the movie, and just from the direction standpoint and the music, I feel like John Carpenter was actually very hands-on, and I miss seeing John Carpenter in films, or at least the John Carpenter that actually cares and isn't just doing something for a paycheck. So I said before about how I thought Dan O'Herlihy was a great villain. He is awesome here. I like how he doesn't really have an Irish accent in the film. However, when he gets super villainous, his accent comes out when he's actually explaining his story and what he's trying to do here with his Silver Shamrock Company and his great trick that he's playing on the children of America and possibly worldwide at that point. Even though I don't know if Halloween is really celebrated worldwide in October. I don't know enough about the history of the actual holiday of Halloween. However, this does go a little bit into the Irish interpretation of Halloween and what it is. And that as well is pretty interesting and something different that we don't normally get. This is a very underrated film with good performances, and even the downbeat ending is pretty awesome. There's a reason why I'm being vague about the ending and the actual overall plot, because it's best to be experienced and be surprised. This movie, for what it is, has a lot of different, I guess, surprises dropped throughout the entire thing. And that's one of the best things about it, is that it plays with the unexpected or the unknown. And for that, I think it's one of the best Halloween sequels if you want to actually consider it part of the series. I know that it does not have a very good rating on IMDb from everybody. It has a 4.9 as of this recording. And also critics, I think, are like at a 50 on Metacritic. And the movie definitely deserves better. It's a cool little flick, and definitely something that if you view it as not being part of the Halloween series, I think you're going to have a good time. If you're going in and know that this movie is a hated film, and also that people don't like it because it doesn't have Michael Myers, well, then you're not going to like it. But hopefully this inspires people to go check it out again, because it's definitely one that deserves better. It's original, it's fun, and not only that, it tells a pretty good story overall, even if it is a bit goofy with the actual story of the movie. So I definitely recommend checking this one out, and hopefully you guys, if you have not seen it before, or if you're rewatching it, hopefully you go and get a different perspective on it and actually realize that it is a very underrated film. And with that, we're going to close out night number 2 of 31 Nights of Frights. As a reminder, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Adam_analyzes. So if you have any comments, suggestions, or questions about anything, I'd love to have a discussion. You can also go to adamanalyzes.com, and good night. Hello and welcome to night number 3 of 31 Nights of Frights, Year 2, the sequel. Maybe that name will stick. Not quite sure on that one yet. But anyway, we should probably get into tonight's episode. With tonight's episode, I wanted to do one that Marvin actually recommended. And this is the 1987 cult favorite. It's not in the classic realm as far as I'm concerned. However, it is definitely a cult favorite. But anyway, this is 1987's The Gate. So, right off the bat, I want to say that this has not been one of my favorites growing up. It is a movie that I did see later in life. I guess if you would consider around the age of 13 or 14 to be later with this one. This is also a movie that kind of fits into the family horror type of film. And it's also one I know that has a pretty big cult following. I do know that it was a big favorite. It was a big deal when it actually made its way to Blu-ray, courtesy of Lionsgate with their Vestron Video label. For those of you who do not know Vestron Video, that is kind of a defunct label from the 80s. They released a lot of films, and Lionsgate, since they own it, decided to exploit it, and The Gate was released under that label. But let's get back to the movie in general, not just on a release. The actual central plot of this movie may be a little much, I guess, for some younger viewers, even though this movie would be perfect for, as I stated before, families. The plot itself revolves around characters Terry and Glenn as they're looking for geodes in their backyard. They found out that the yard had geodes in it because of the fact that a tree was getting removed, and once you know it, there was a geode. So the plot is kind of funny because not only does this hole have geodes, just so happens to be a gateway to hell. I know, happens all the time. So while this is a gateway to hell, a few things have to occur in order for this gateway to actually be completely opened with the demons to come out. The plot itself is kind of thin throughout the movie. Instead, the director, Tibor Takacs, however you say his last name, I'm not quite sure. He wants to spend a lot more time trying to make you think that the movie is scary. There's a lot of scenes where there'll be just slow zoom-ins and such throughout. It doesn't quite work, and it doesn't serve the movie well. His direction attempts to have some style, but yet it kind of falls flat, and honestly the movie drags a little bit. For a movie that's only about an hour and a half, it really felt like I was watching it for well over 2 hours. I don't know if anyone else has ever gotten that feeling in watching this film, but while it's fun, it's also kind of on the boring side, and that's one of the worst things about this one. It just drags. I don't know how to describe it. There's not a whole lot of actual plot advancement. I do think some of the visuals are cool, and some of the special effects, the stop motion effects for the little demons are definitely fun. It's also fun when you do see some zombies in this for no reason at all. Only thing I can think of is it's because Glenn and Terry are actually watching a horror film on the TV that involves zombies. That's the only thing I can think of why there's actually zombies crashing through the walls. But the movie itself is one I could definitely recommend. It's one of those that you should see at least once if you've never seen it. It has that definite cult following, and that's a big reason why you should probably check it out. This is also the debut of actor Stephen Dorff. For those of you who do not know, he was in Blade and a couple other films throughout the years, but I would say Blade is one of the things that he's most well known for. And if I'm remembering correctly, he's on the 3rd season of True Detective. So he's still getting work, and this is his first starring movie role. I will have to say that it is kind of funny that the whole secret to opening up the gate and closing the gate revolves around a heavy metal record that the character of Terry, played by Louis Tripp, actually owns. It's kind of humorous overall that would be the central main plot point and the secret of opening and closing the gate. So I kind of appreciate the movie for that. Other people in the film, such as Krista Denton, she's, I guess, fine in her role as the annoying yet loving big sister to Glenn. If I had one thing to compare this movie to, for whatever reason, it gives me a definite feeling of Jim Henson's Labyrinth. And it's probably not a fair comparison considering they're two completely different movies. But as far as feel-wise, it just gave me that kind of feel. I could be completely wrong and misguided with that, but that's probably the only thing I could really compare it to as far as feel-wise. But with a much lower budget and not as good special effects. Like I said, the stop-motion stuff is definitely cool. And I did like the little demons, they're kind of neat. Makes you kind of want to, keep one as a pet or something with the way that they're carried out here. Instead of being scary, they're just incredibly cute looking. The big demon at the end of the movie is also well done for what they had. And then the actual, I guess, hell on earth scene when hell actually opens up is kind of neat with the way it's shown here. I kind of like the way the visuals were. But overall, again, this is not one that I love, but I enjoy it for what it is. I don't know how many times I'll watch it. It's definitely not one that is a favorite of mine, but it's not bad either. And as I stated, definitely check it out. If you got families, it's perfect for a movie that might frighten the kids a little bit, but may not be too scary, and would just be a good time for some October viewing. But with that being said, I think I'm going to close out tonight's episode. As a reminder, you guys can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Adam_analyzes. Also, I have my own Adam Analyzes webpage. And make sure you keep your ears peeled for the contest that I'm going to be running a few episodes down. Not going to say exactly when that's happening, but I definitely have a contest for you guys, and I think you're going to enjoy the prize. But with that, good night. Hello, and welcome to night number 4 of 31 Nights of Frights, Year 2, the sequel. Hopefully you guys have been enjoying the different movies I've been talking about so far. I know we're only 4 nights into it. I had some favorites on there, and one that is not a favorite. Well, a favorite to most. It's a favorite of mine, looking at you, Halloween 3. But anyway, let's get on with night number 4. This is director Ryuhei Kitamura's 2008 adaptation of Clive Barker's short story, The Midnight Meat Train. This movie actually has a little bit of an interesting history, as well as somebody before they were famous, which we'll get into a little bit later in the episode. This movie was actually treated very unfairly by Lionsgate. It was set for a theatrical release, which it kind of got, but yet it was at the second and third run theaters, yet it was supposed to be a wide release. I actually remember seeing the trailer for this movie in theaters. It might have been for one of the Saw films, I don't know. If I remember correctly, it was supposed to be a January-February release, which I think it could have made a little bit of money with the right promotion behind it. But Lionsgate didn't know what to do with the movie, so they decided to go and release it to those second and third run theaters, as well as for free on service FearNet. For anybody that doesn't know, FearNet was actually an on-demand service on various cable and satellite providers. I was a fan of it. I thought it was kind of neat that you could just fire up a horror movie on there whenever you wanted. And they wound up releasing this to that as well as that sort of theatrical release. I'm actually going to say right off the bat, this movie deserved better treatment. It's a very well done movie. I'm not exactly a fan of writer Jeff Bueller, who did the adaptation of the script, but he did a good job here, and I think Clive Barker actually had approval on, I guess, probably like final cut and say over what was there and what wasn't in the script. So everything about this movie seems like it should have been a somewhat decent success, a little bit of a moneymaker for all parties involved. But sadly, the crappy distribution behind it, the movie more or less got shelved. At least it got released, but it's kind of a shame that it didn't get a bigger release. So if I was to give an actual plot synopsis of this film, it would probably be all over the place because there is a lot of things going on with this movie. So I am going to read the synopsis from Internet Movie Database. A photographer's obsessive pursuit of dark subject matter leads him into the path of a serial killer who stalks late-night commuters, ultimately butchering them in the most gruesome ways imaginable. That's actually only part of the plot. The actual plot is not just butchering of people, but the fact that there's a race of creatures in closed sections of the subway in New York, which I think is actually a pretty cool idea, and it's definitely on the creepy side of things. So let's jump into some pretty cool things about this movie. One of the coolest things, I think, is the fact that Bradley Cooper, this was one of his starring roles, and it's before he got pretty popular. That's right, this is before the Hangover films, probably about a year or so before the Hangover film, the first one, came out. And he actually does a really good job here as a, I guess, struggling photographer. And not just a struggling photographer, but a photographer that wants to be somebody. And in his quest for being somebody, he winds up losing it all. And I'm not going to give that plot point away, but it's actually pretty cool with the way things turn out. Also kind of sad in a way, which I think the movie did a good job of not just showing the blood and gore, but there's a little bit of the, I guess, poetic nature of Clive Barker's writings that actually shines through here. I think director Ryuhei Kitamura, I think he showed some very flashy direction here, and this was one of my first times of seeing one of his films. I always intended on checking out other ones that he's made, but he shows flash, but he also knows when to, I guess, restrain himself and knowing, hey, this scene needs a chance to breathe. And everything is very, very well done, which it just kills me that this movie got the treatment that it did. I think all of the actors involved, I think they do a great job here. Bradley Cooper definitely sells it as somebody that is willing to push himself to the limit and see how far he can go with his photography because he wants to be a famous photographer. And then you have his girlfriend in the movie, played by Leslie Bibb. She actually does a good job as well. She wants to try to save him from himself. Ultimately, she fails. No, that's not really a spoiler. But you also have the character of Vinnie Jones playing Mahogany. Vinnie Jones does a great job, and he is definitely scary. Somebody you don't want to see on the streets. He's very cold with the way he plays the role, and he's perfect in it. And I'm not a huge fan of Vinnie Jones in general. However, he does a great job of being menacing here. Another cool thing about this movie is that Brooke Shields is in it, and she's not in it much, but the fact that she plays an art dealer that actually has Clive Barker's art being featured, I think is a really cool, nice touch. The only real complaint I have with this movie is that we're not shown enough. I would like to know a little bit more about these creatures that lurk in the New York City subway system. And then also, it has an over-reliance on, I guess, CGI blood and gore. You have actor Ted Raimi that makes a cameo here, which I thought was kind of cool too. His death in the movie, it's not good looking at all. I understand, like, it looks pretty neat as far as the way it's shown. I'm just not a fan of the way CGI blood and gore, it doesn't look real. And I guess it might be an easier way for people to digest it because there are some pretty nasty things shown. I would imagine the CGI nature of everything is probably a budgetary reason of why they did that. This movie definitely feels small scale in a lot of ways, and maybe that's one thing that scared Lionsgate off. But it doesn't look amateurish by any means. It's just that some of the blood and gore definitely takes you out because you know it's fake and that you're watching a movie. This here is a movie that we didn't need a sequel, and considering with the way this movie ends, we wouldn't get a sequel necessarily, or at least with Bradley Cooper, with how he shot to stardom shortly after this movie was made. However, I would like to see more about this movie, and I guess I'm going to have to read the short story someday. You guys probably don't know this, but I am a pretty big fan of some of Clive Barker's works. This one here is in the Books of Blood series, and I just haven't checked those out, but I heard that they are pretty great. But in thinking about it, we don't necessarily need a sequel to this movie in general, but I would like to see more about the creatures themselves, and why is there like a understanding seemingly between the subway driver and the Mahogany character. Why do they have to keep these creatures fed? I mean, they could just go ahead and kill them, but it seems like an order is keeping them down there, and it's almost like a, I guess, truce to keep them down there. As long as they're fed, they're not going to come up and attack people. So I guess it's an idea of being about the greater good. We don't really know. We're not shown that. But having recently gone to New York, and for a couple days, that's how I got around, was simply walking and the subway system. I could imagine the subway would be a creepy place at night in general. I mean, this was a great idea on Clive Barker's part, and I would really like to just see a little bit more. But sadly, this movie, outside of being kind of like a cult favorite, I guess, maybe, I don't quite know if the fan base is really there for this one. I'm a fan of it, and I did show it to my girlfriend, and she said it was actually a really good movie. She was impressed by it, and she knew next to nothing about it. So, I don't know. I would definitely like to see a little bit more. Sadly, we will not get that. One thing I do want to touch on without giving anything away, really, is the ending of the movie. The ending of the movie is extremely well done. It's one of those that it definitely ends on a downbeat ending. It's not a happy ending by any means. And I guess some people would probably say the ending flat out sucks. I actually liked it. It's heartbreaking because of... It's definitely an ending that I think is very heartbreaking just by the things that are implied by the end of it, and almost like a living through a personal hell by the end of it. It's just one of those that really stuck with me. The whole movie sticks with me, but the ending is just something that really grabbed me. And I'm a fan of movies that have a definite closure, leave it slightly open, but they end on a thought-provoking and even sad note. It's one of those things that you can watch a movie and it can have a lingering effect, and this movie definitely did have that. If you have not checked out this movie, I definitely recommend checking it out. It's one of my favorite lesser-known films, and as far as I know, a lot of people do like this movie. It's just not a very popular one by any means. And it's a shame. I think everybody involved deserved better. Clive Barker definitely deserves better. I think more of his works needs to get adapted into actual good movies. And not only that, I mean, Ryuhei Kitamura, I mean, he should have directed more English language films. I think this was probably meant to be like his breakthrough into Hollywood, and sadly it didn't really get him there. So definitely check this one out. I know you can pick up the Blu-ray cheap nowadays. It's probably streaming and such as well. Definitely give it a watch. It's a very underrated film. It's a very unloved film by a lot of people. But yeah, check it out. With that, I think I'm going to close out tonight's episode. As a reminder, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Adam_analyzes. Also, I got a website, adamanalyzes.com. If you guys have not checked it out yet, check out In Our Honest Opinion. That is our podcast. You can hear more of my voice as well as the voice of Marvin and Will on there. But with that, good night. Hello and welcome to night number 5 of 31 Nights of Frights, Year 2, the sequel. So for night number 5, I wanted to speak about another Clive Barker film. This one he actually wrote and directed. This one is a little bit different, I guess, feel-wise from some of his other works, such as Hellraiser and Nightbreed. Sadly, he's only directed 3 films so far. But this one here was his last directorial effort. It's an adaptation of his own short story, The Last Illusion. This is Clive Barker's 1995, somewhat classic, Lord of Illusions. Starring Scott Bakula and Famke Janssen, along with Kevin J. O'Connor, the movie tells the story of Harry D'Amour, who takes a case out in Los Angeles which involves a whole plot with cult members who are awaiting the resurrection of their cult leader, Nyx, as well as illusionist Philip Swan, who stopped Nyx many years ago. So there is a whole lot of things going on with this movie. I think quite possibly one of the most interesting aspects of this movie is the villain, the creature, the one that usually winds up being almost the good guy in a Clive Barker story, such as Nightbreed, for example. The monsters were really the good guys. And not only that, I think in his other works, such as Hellraiser, Pinhead isn't exactly the villain. So in this movie, we actually have the cult leader Nyx, who is just a straight up bad guy. He does get resurrected 13 years after his death, and he is a creature, but he is by no means a good guy. It's very clear cut. It's not like his other films where you're kind of not sure about everything. This one here is pretty straightforward. The other thing that is pretty straightforward here is the fact that it's not a straight up horror film. That's right, if you're looking for an actual horror film, you're not going to get it here. Instead, you're getting a noir type of detective story that has horror elements. It definitely has some blood and gore. It definitely has some disturbing moments, and I do recommend you check out the director's cut, not the original R-rated theatrical film. The R-rated theatrical film is not nearly as good, and the director's cut, I think, might be about 10 to 15 minutes longer, so there is more plot, and then there is also some scenes that I miss when I watch the R-rated version. So with that, I think it's actually interesting that Clive Barker maybe tried to subvert expectations or tried to create something different here. And I really applaud him for being able to pull it off. And by saying that he actually pulled off the balancing act of the horror mixed with the noir, the movie itself is kind of messy plot-wise because it does feel a little bit longer than what it is. And not only that, he doesn't really carry through a lot of his ideas far enough. And I think that's only because he thinks as a writer when he's writing a script or when he's directing. But for the most part, this movie is very good, and it's very underrated. It's not a movie that a lot of people mention nowadays, and I think Scott Bakula is probably perfect for the role of Harry D'Amour, and I would really like to see some more Harry D'Amour starring films, but we're not going to get those. This movie wasn't really a big success for Clive Barker, but watching the making of and stuff on the Blu-ray and DVD in the past, I really appreciate what was done here. It had a lot of heart to it, and I like the fact too that he knew exactly what he wanted to shoot. He also knew exactly when a person was right for casting. So it's all the pieces definitely lined up. It's just the movie is a little disjointed with the plot. If you can get over that, you'll be rewarded with a fairly deep movie that makes you think a little bit. The movie definitely has some very cool special effects. Sadly, some of the special effects are not very cool, such as some of the CGI effects. But I would say that the effects here that are CGI that stick out pretty poorly are easier to digest because this is actually where CGI was in its infancy. And Clive Barker, I think, knew where to go from an art standpoint as far as making them look cool. Even some of the rough-looking CGI effects are kind of neat-looking. I really appreciate what he did there. I do have a soft spot for this movie, and that's mostly because I remember my mom coming home one night. I was asleep on the sofa. She came home, and this is when we had all the various movie channels and stuff. And it was cool because Lord of Illusions was on. I remember I woke up and we wound up watching the whole thing. And it always remained a favorite of mine as well as hers. And it's just a really well-rounded movie. Outside of the slightly disjointed plot, I mean, you're very rewarded with little twists and turns that the script takes along the way. And sadly, this is probably going to be one of the last directorial efforts we get from Clive Barker. He was going to do the Hellraiser remake at one point. I know he was definitely writing it, and the script was turned down by, well, the Weinsteins. And I don't know why, but rumor has it he was going to direct that Hellraiser remake or reboot or reimagining, whatever you want to call it. And I hate to think that this is going to be the last movie that we get from the guy. It is a good possibility that he may find something, and health permitting, there will be something that brings him back to the director's chair. I am all for seeing another Clive Barker film. I would actually like to see The Thief of Always. I know it's a children's book, but I would like to see that adapted with a dark, I guess, fairy tale type of feel. Make it maybe something like in the vein of The Never-Ending Story or Labyrinth or even The Dark Crystal. Something that everybody could watch. But if not, I'd like to see him make another film. This is actually not a bad film if this is in fact his last directed film. It's not a bad film to go out on. It's just I would like to see more. It would actually be good to see a sequel to this, maybe pick up 20-something years later with an older Harry D'Amour and still doing some paranormal investigation. It would kind of be neat. I don't know if a Lord of Illusions, like an actual sequel, is really needed. And I don't know if the fan base would be there. I know that I would just welcome some more directed films, or written and directed films from Clive Barker. Back to the actual movie itself, one thing I did like was the Nix character. He's definitely a very bad dude, a definite menacing villain. And it's played out here very well. I like the fact that Nix is actually going to take over the world of like a, I guess, reverse Jesus type of figure. He would be more or less like the Antichrist and was poised to take over. And it's an interesting thing to actually have that as a cult leader that would have that much influence over his followers. And the fact that people may go and, I guess, follow him further. He winds up killing all of his followers here in the movie. However, that's not to say that he wouldn't gain in popularity and still gain new followers. So I think that aspect is actually kind of interesting. And the interesting thing about it too is that the character of Swan would have been the one to help him carry that out. Swan resists and ultimately helps take out Nix by the end of it. That's not a huge spoiler. There's actually other things in the plot that if I talked about would be more spoilery. However, I do think that the whole aspect of the cult and world domination is a fascinating thing, and I don't know if it was meant intentionally as a jab at like religion from Clive Barker, but it was pretty good with the way it carries out in the film. So if you have not seen this movie, I definitely recommend checking it out, and it deserves to be seen. Basically, it's a movie that I don't think has a huge fan base, but it should. But with that being said, I think I'm going to close out tonight's episode. As a reminder, you can find me on Instagram and Twitter at Adam_analyzes. Also, check me out at adamanalyzes.com. With that, good night. Hello and welcome to night number 6 of 31 Nights of Frights, Year 2, the sequel. So for tonight's episode, I wanted to do, a follow-up to the first night, and I wanted to discuss a very unloved and underappreciated sequel, but it's not half bad, and that is the George A. Romero written and Michael Gornick directed 1987 Creepshow 2. So, Creepshow 2, I have a little bit of a, love-hate relationship with this one. This one here is one that it is very noticeable that the budget was not nearly as high for this one. The star power isn't there. You don't have the assured direction from George A. Romero in the first. If you haven't listened to the first night, the first one, George A. Romero really captured the 50s EC comics vibe and feel well. And in this one, director Michael Gornick goes with a more straight-ahead approach, and it suits the movie fine, and this movie I think is probably only a failure when you compare it to the first Creepshow. If you were to just go ahead and take this as just another anthology film, it's actually very good. But when you compare it to the first one and consider this to be a sequel to the first one, that's when it is noticeable that it's not even close to being in the same league as the first one. So for Creepshow 2, instead of having 5 stories and a wraparound, in this one we get 3 stories and a wraparound. What's interesting is that the wraparound is actually done with animation. Now the animation is on the cheaper end of things. That's one of the worst things about the animation. However, I do admire what they did with the animation because it reminds me of a lot of the 80s cartoons. And honestly, to just try something different here, it's kind of cool. It makes the movie unique, and I would say it's probably one of the standout things of this movie because the stories themselves don't really compare to the original in a lot of ways. The 3 stories that we get here are Old Chief Woodenhead, we get The Raft, and then we get The Hitchhiker. All 3 of them are fine, and I don't want to really knock George Romero's script work. However, he wasn't really known for writing a lot of great scripts, and that's definitely apparent here. I think the movie could have used a script by Stephen King, or even a script polish by Stephen King, to maybe add a little bit of flair or something to it, because everything here, it just feels generic. We don't get those cool moments from the first movie where it looks like a comic book panel brought to life. Instead, everything is stock with its direction. However, the one thing that makes it feel like a comic book or comic book-esque, again, is that animation. So it's kind of a trade-off. It just would have been nice to see something, I guess, that would look more like the original or more like the source material that inspired the Creepshow series. If I had to pick one story that I actually really enjoyed here, it would probably be The Raft, and that is actually taken from a Stephen King short story. I read the short story before actually seeing Creepshow 2 when I was a kid, so I was well aware of how the story was going to wind up. For whatever reason, when I was a kid, I watched the first Creepshow a lot, and I had no idea there was a Creepshow 2. My mom never rented it or anything like that, so I had no idea. I only saw Creepshow 2 much later in life. I do enjoy the movie, but again, the first one is far superior. The other two stories, such as Old Chief Woodenhead and The Hitchhiker, I'm going to focus on the Chief Woodenhead one. In that one, we get a owner of a general store who I'm assuming owns this on a reservation. And basically, the Native Americans there actually really like him, and he really likes them and thinks of them as their people and everything. So it's a little bit of a social commentary there. It's very slight. However, the chief himself, he looks cool, but he looks very rubbery. He doesn't look like he's made out of wood. And we just get a standard, I guess, revenge spree story. And it's cool. It's not really horror. And that's one of the worst things about that one. It's entertaining for what it is. And I did like one part of this, because inside the general store, he has a whole rack of comics, and all the comics are Creepshow comics, so the movie breaks the fourth wall a little bit there, which is pretty neat. It wasn't really done so much at the time, however, it was done pretty well. It's just a nice little wink and nod that you're watching Creepshow, because you wouldn't really know it, because we do not have those little nods to let us know that we're watching something influenced from the horror comics of the 50s. But let's move on to The Hitchhiker. The Hitchhiker involves a cheating wife who just so happens to hit a hitchhiker. She hits him and is stalked repeatedly throughout the segment. And yeah, it's not bad, again, but it was a little disappointing that it ends so normal. There's nothing really unique or special about it. They could have went a couple different directions here, but instead it's pretty straightforward. What is nice is that we get a Stephen King cameo, and it's only for a second, but hey, it's in there, so that's a nice little nod to the original film. And one of the things that I really want to get out of the way here too, the Hitchhiker episode or story, whatever you want to call it, he looks really weird by the end of it. He's very goopy, and it's a very strange choice by Tom Savini. One of the cool things here I do want to mention that I forgot to mention, Tom Savini actually plays the creep in the real life portion and also does the voice of the creep for the animated portion. So that's kind of cool too. If you guys want me to talk about The Raft, again, that's the best one out of the bunch. And also, The Raft is a straight ahead story. It does have a little bit of a gotcha moment towards the end. And I kind of appreciate that because it reminds me of the little twists of the original Creepshow stories. And also reminds me a little bit of the, I guess, irony of the EC Comics Tales from the Crypt, Vaults of Horror Haunt of Fear, all of that stuff. It gives me a definite vibe of that. So if you guys haven't seen Creepshow 2, I definitely recommend checking it out because it's infinitely better than what is actually known as Creepshow 3. There is a Creepshow 3 out there, and I will be talking about that one. But that one's going to be a difficult one to get through because I'm going to have to, for one, rewatch it, and another, I'm going to wind up ripping it to shreds because it makes Creepshow 2 look like an Oscar-winning film by comparison. But that's a different discussion for a different night. So with Creepshow 2, basically what we got here is a movie that is a serviceable, not half bad, but not great sequel to a great classic original. But with that being said, I think I'm going to close out tonight's episode. As a reminder, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Adam_analyzes. And also keep an ear out for the contest that I'm going to be running very, very soon. But with that, good night. Hello and welcome to night number 7 of 31 Nights of Fright, Year 2, the sequel. So for tonight's episode, let's take a trip back, all the way back to 1994. That's right, we're going back to the 90s. The 90s was an interesting time. A lot of the horror films of the time were very stock and generic and self-referential. And I would say Scream was probably the biggest one that really kicked off that whole self-referential horror of the 90s. However, we're not talking about Scream tonight. We're talking about the 1994 John Flynn directed, Edward Furlong starring Brainscan. So a little history with me with this movie. I saw this movie in theaters back in 94. I had no idea what it was other than the trickster character on the poster and the commercials being played for it. And I remember the tagline pretty vividly. They said it was an interactive trip to hell. Well, sign me up. I wanted to see that one. But really, the only other thing that I really knew about this movie was the fact that Edward Furlong was actually in this movie. And I didn't know that he was a subpar actor. I just knew, hey, that was the guy that was in Pet Sematary 2 and Terminator 2. So I kind of wanted to see it because of that. My mom took me to see it, and both of us weren't really impressed by it. However, I did rent it when it came out on VHS. We rewatched it again, and I remember we both had a different opinion of it. We actually liked it a little bit better, both my mom and I. Brainscan is honestly pure 90s cheese. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It works well for what's presented here. The movie is not half bad if you're gonna go check it out for the first time. The trickster character is solid, and also it's pretty cool that it was written by screenwriter Andrew Kevin Walker, who also did better movies such as Seven, Sleepy Hollow. He also did 8mm as well, all solid films, and he's really not a bad writer. Brainscan tells the story of a kid that you see at the beginning. He was presumably in a car accident, has a damaged knee. Also is into horror movies and has a little bit of a isolation issue, I'm guessing because of the death of his mother affecting him. And his father, which is established early on in the movie, isn't really there. His father left him alone presumably for about a week or so, maybe even longer, who knows. His best friend tells him about this game called Brainscan that is supposed to be the scariest interactive terror experience that you'll ever have in your life, and he decides to order it. After he starts playing Brainscan, everything seems to, I guess, fall apart at that point because the game encourages him to be a murderer, and he has the stress of the cops on his trail. With this, you don't know if the game is real or not. It does answer that by the end of the movie. And I guess it's an interesting thing because the 90s were where we were really getting into a lot of the virtual reality and interactive experiences. At least creatively, movies were doing this. However, we didn't really see a lot of that, or at least I didn't see a lot of that in real life in Pennsylvania when I was growing up. But if you want to really think about different things in the 90s that used virtual reality, you have movies like The Lawnmower Man, you had The Ghost in the Machine, which had some VR parts to it. And Brainscan is really no different than a lot of those other cheesy 90s horror films. I do want to get one thing out of the way. I had trouble buying one actor in this movie, buying their performance anyway, and that is Edward Furlong. I didn't really get the feeling that he was this isolated kid. Instead, I got the feeling of somebody playing somebody that's isolated and what would be known back in the day or even in the 2000s as an emo type of kid. So his performance didn't really work here. However, he did emote a little bit better here than he did in, say, Pet Sematary 2 and Terminator 2, so at least he was growing as an actor. So I will give him a little bit of credit where credit is due. Just I didn't buy his performance, even though he's better here than what he was in those other two films that I've seen him in. I think one of the most interesting things here is his room setup. He has a room in his attic, and this thing is actually kind of cool. I mean, he's got a refrigerator up there, he's got his bed, he's got his computer set up and TV, and even his TV/monitor is actually widescreen. And that actually amazed me because this is before widescreen was even a thought. And I don't know where they got this idea at, but it was actually a little bit of forward thinking on the director's part, I guess. I don't know if it was intentional or not, but it's kind of cool. So getting back to the plot a little bit here, it's interesting because he is not really guided in his first kill and first disc, because the Brainscan game is actually spread across 4 discs and he receives them in the mail almost like a subscription. So each disc would have, I guess, a different scenario or a continuing scenario, even though this here, it's established that it was based off of his brain. So I'm going to think that since he got a killer scenario here, that a killer or a killer idea actually resided in his mind all along. I don't know. The trickster character says that it resides in everybody's mind, and I guess the game uses that as a way for people to enact their fantasies. I'm kind of bothered by that because of the fact that in the movie, Edward Furlong's character of Michael is emotionally absent, and also he's a loner that is a little bit of a voyeur. He does spy on the girl next door as she's getting changed, and it is said later in the movie she is doing the same thing to him, so maybe that's what the 90s was. A bunch of voyeurs floating around. I don't know. Of course, I'm kidding with that one. But it almost makes it like because he was into horror films and was emotionally damaged as a kid, that's the reason why he could be a murderer. I don't know if that's exactly the case. You know, I don't know psychology very well or anything like that. But for the movie to establish that, it kind of bothers me a little bit. And I don't know if that was supposed to be a little bit of a social commentary jab at the horror genre in general. It's a good possibility because, as I said, the movie seems like it's self-referential. It's just, I don't know, it kind of bothers me a little bit because there is a comparison early on in the movie where the principal of his school shuts down his horror movie club, and they almost make it a point to compare horror movies to pornography, and then that principal also said that if you watch pornography, then you're going to go out and be a rapist. So I don't think that that's really true. However, that's what the movie says, and it just bothers me a little bit. But outside of all of that, I would say the trickster character is very entertaining. He's almost like a demon that's residing inside of the game. He's the little demon on Michael's shoulder, telling him to go and commit murders, telling him to take care of all the evidence. So it's kind of entertaining to see him work. He's funny, but darkly humorous with the way he says and does things. Thankfully, the character actor of T. Ryder Smith doesn't specifically play it up for laughs, and he doesn't play it super dark. He kind of does a combination of both, and he's probably one of the strongest parts of this movie. His character is actually pretty awesome, and I wouldn't have minded seeing more of his character. However, I don't necessarily want to see a Brainscan sequel. Granted, this is almost 25 years after the movie came out, if not actually 25 years. So I don't think we're going to be getting a sequel at any point in time, and I don't think we're going to be getting another visit from the trickster character. However, I wouldn't have minded seeing more of him. He was one of the best parts of the movie. So what we have here with Brainscan is almost like a time capsule. This is pure 90s. It definitely feels 90s. And it's one of the most 90s movies out there, in my opinion, next to other things that came out around the same time. But it's definitely worth a watch. It's a pretty well-written movie. It is kind of funny, and also, I don't know about that twist. So if any of you guys actually check this movie out or have seen it before, let me know what you think of that, because the movie says one thing with the twist, however it says something else with the almost post-credits sequence, and it's not quite a post-credits sequence. However, the credits are going for about 10 seconds, and then all of a sudden the screen breaks away and we hear the trickster's voice again. So I don't know. I guess it's really open to interpretation as far as which ending you like better, because it almost supplies two endings as a what if on both. So definitely hit me up if you guys have any input on that or opinions on that. Just to let you guys know, you can find me at Adam_analyzes on Twitter and Instagram. And on the last night, I forgot to mention my website, but you can also go to adamanalyzes.com. And also keep your ears open for that contest. It's coming up shortly. With that being said, good night.